she was radiant, her glittering gown catching every beam of light as she swayed to the music. Guests clapped, champagne glasses clinked, and her young husband held her close, his hands firm around hers. But then, without warning, she froze mid-step, her body faltered, and the room fell silent. In an instant, the bride, the 75-year-old millionaire Maureen Larkwood, collapsed onto the polished floor, lifeless. The joy of the celebration shattered into chaos. And as paramedics rushed in, a single question echoed louder than the wedding vows: how could this happen? To the world, it seemed tragic but not improbable. A woman of her age, on her wedding day, surely it was natural? The story begins long before this day, long before the vows and the dance. Maureen Larkwood wasn't just any woman. She was a force, unyielding, controlling, and determined to protect her empire at all costs. Her daughter, Serafina, was a different story, a woman struggling to escape the shadow of her mother's dominance and the guilt of a father's untimely death. And then there was Kamari, a man whose charm masked ambitions far greater than anyone realized. How did this trio, so different yet so deeply connected, end up here? How did Maureen, a woman who controlled everything, lose her life on the day she believed she'd gained it all? What unfolds is a tale of betrayal and greed, a story that shows the darkness lurking behind glittering wealth. Was this the final act of a daughter's revenge? A young man's desperate gamble? Or something even more twisted? This isn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It's about the lengths people will go to for power, for freedom, for revenge. And as we unravel the events that led to Maureen's final dance, one thing becomes clear: no one in this story is without blame. If you're captivated by true stories that reveal the unexpected depths of human nature, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. Dive with us into the mysteries, the heartbreaks, and the gripping tales that remind us how fragile trust can be. Join us as we uncover stories that linger long after they're told. Let's begin. Before her final days became a whirlwind of scandal and tragedy, Maureen Larkwood was a woman who seemed untouchable. Born into a modest family in Atlanta, Maureen's rise to power was anything but ordinary. While others dreamed of comfort, she dreamed of control, of a life where she dictated every move, every decision, every outcome. And for most of her 75 years, she succeeded. Maureen's wealth wasn't inherited, at least not in the traditional sense. Her father, a small-time landlord, left her a handful of decrepit rental properties. Instead of selling them off for quick cash, Maureen saw potential. She rebuilt, invested, and expanded, turning a meager inheritance into a thriving real estate empire. By her mid-30s, she was a millionaire, her name synonymous with wealth and power in her community. Her estate, sprawling across acres, was a testament to her ambition, a symbol of everything she had built through sheer determination. But beneath her success lay a trait that would define her relationships: control. Maureen wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a force of nature, someone who demanded perfection and loyalty in every sphere of her life. Those who dared challenge her often found themselves cut off, both personally and professionally. And no one felt this more deeply than her own family. Maureen's world shifted dramatically when she met her husband, Leonard Larkwood, a soft-spoken attorney with a love for life's simple pleasures. Leonard balanced Maureen's sharp edges with his warmth and compassion. Together, they built a life that appeared picture-perfect. But while Leonard cherished their family, Maureen focused on expanding their wealth, ensuring that their daughter, Serafina, would inherit more than they ever dreamed of. Then came the tragedy that shattered it all. It happened on a rainy spring afternoon, the kind of day where the world seemed to move in slow motion. Serafina, just 19 at the time, was out with friends, racing down wet roads in her new sports car, a gift from her father. Leonard had always been softer on Serafina than Maureen liked, indulging her in ways that fueled Maureen's frustration. That indulgence, Maureen believed, had been a mistake. The crash was brutal. Serafina's car skidded off the road, slamming into a tree. The moment Maureen got the call, Leonard didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and rushed to the hospital, his heart racing with fear for his daughter. But Leonard never made it. On the way, his car collided with a truck at an intersection. He was killed instantly. For Maureen, the loss was devastating. But grief quickly turned to anger, and that anger had a target: her daughter. In her eyes, Leonard's death wasn't just an accident, it was the result of Serafina's recklessness, her selfish need for thrill and attention. From that day forward, Maureen could never look at her daughter the same way again. The once close bond between mother and daughter unraveled. Maureen became colder, more distant, her words sharp and unforgiving. To her, Serafina wasn't just her daughter, she was the reason Leonard was gone. And Serafina, overwhelmed by guilt, had no choice but to endure her mother's scorn. But guilt didn't just break Serafina, it changed her. Determined to prove she wasn't the careless, spoiled child her mother believed her to be, Serafina worked to turn her life around. She abandoned the parties and the wild friends, focusing instead on her education and personal growth. She longed for her mother's approval, for some sign that the woman who once cradled her with love could still see her as more than a disappointment. Years passed, but the bitterness between them festered. Every interaction was a battlefield, every word a potential weapon. Maureen saw her daughter as a fragile remnant of a family she had lost, while Serafina saw her mother as a fortress she could never breach. It was a relationship defined by silence, resentment, and a shared grief neither could escape. When Maureen met Kamari Blake, the charismatic young man who would ultimately become her downfall, she likely saw him as something more than a potential husband. Perhaps he was a chance to reclaim the joy she had lost with Leonard. Or perhaps he was another tool to assert her control, this time, not just over her wealth but over her daughter's future as well. And for Serafina, meeting Kamari didn't just reignite her desire for love, it lit a fire of rebellion that would change everything. The stage was set. A controlling mother, a grieving daughter, and a young man caught between them. Their lives, already fractured, would collide in ways no one could predict. And as the past continued to haunt them, the future would unravel into betrayal, deception, and murder. This was no ordinary family. And this was no ordinary tragedy. For Serafina Larkwood, life had become a monotonous cycle of guilt and isolation. The weight of her father's death loomed over her like an unrelenting shadow, amplified by her mother's cold disdain. Yet, amid the darkness, she sought change, a glimmer of light that could remind her of the person she used to be before tragedy struck. That light came in the form of a man named Kamari Blake. Their first meeting was unplanned, almost serendipitous. It was a quiet evening at a local art gallery, a rare escape for Serafina from the confines of her family estate. She stood before a vibrant painting, her mind lost in thoughts of the past, when a warm voice broke through her solitude. "You've been staring at that piece for a while," the voice said, tinged with curiosity and charm. "Do you see something in it that the rest of us are missing?" Serafina turned, slightly startled, to find a man who seemed out of place among the suits and evening gowns of the gallery. Kamari was casually dressed, his confidence evident in his easy smile and the way he carried himself. For a moment, she felt a flicker of annoyance. Who was this stranger to interrupt her thoughts? But his sincerity disarmed her. "I'm not sure," she replied, gesturing toward the painting. "I guess I just like the chaos of it." "Chaos can be beautiful," Kamari said, his eyes meeting hers. "It's where the most interesting stories happen." In that moment, Serafina felt an unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he spoke them, as though he understood something about her that even she struggled to articulate. That night, their conversation flowed effortlessly, from art to life to the unspoken struggles that seemed to connect them. Kamari wasn't like the people Serafina had grown up with. He didn't come from wealth or privilege, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that intrigued her. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened. They met for coffee, strolled through parks, and talked about everything from their dreams to their regrets. Kamari's presence was like a balm to Serafina's wounded soul. He listened without judgment, offering her the kind of understanding she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since her father's death, Serafina began to feel alive again. Kamari didn't see her as the daughter of a powerful matriarch or the product of wealth, he saw her for who she was, a woman trying to rebuild herself from the ashes of her past. And for that, she clung to him with a mix of hope and desperation. It wasn't long before Serafina decided to bring Kamari home. She knew it was a risk. Her mother, Maureen, rarely approved of anything she did, let alone someone she might care about. But Serafina believed Kamari was different. Perhaps he could bridge the chasm between her and her mother, or at the very least, show her mother that she was capable of making a good choice. The day Kamari stepped into the Larkwood estate was one Serafina would never forget. Dressed in a crisp shirt and jacket, he looked every bit the gentleman, though his unease was evident as he took in the grandeur of the estate. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, the furniture meticulously arranged to reflect Maureen's uncompromising taste. Kamari's charm faltered slightly under the weight of the Larkwood wealth, but Serafina squeezed his hand, silently reassuring him. Maureen's reaction was immediate. She appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her sharp gaze scanning Kamari with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. Maureen descended slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached them. "This must be Kamari," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "Serafina's told me very little about you." Kamari extended his hand, his smile polite but wary. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Larkwood." Maureen's handshake was firm, her eyes studying him as though he were an artifact she couldn't quite place. "Charming," she said, though the word carried an edge Serafina couldn't ignore. "Serafina, darling, why don't you show Kamari around the estate? I'm sure he'll find it illuminating." What Serafina didn't know at the time was that her mother's mind was already racing. Maureen saw something in Kamari, a spark, a confidence, a raw potential that intrigued her. And while she recognized his connection to her daughter, Maureen had never been one to let sentimentality dictate her decisions. The first seed of Maureen's plan was planted that day. She watched the way Kamari carried himself, the ease with which he navigated conversations, and the way his smile could disarm even the most guarded person. For the first time in years, Maureen felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Leonard's death: desire. As Kamari and Serafina walked through the estate, Maureen's gaze lingered. She knew the lines she was about to cross, but to her, lines were meant to be redrawn. What she wanted, she took always. And Kamari, with his charm and potential, was no exception. Days later, Maureen made her move. She invited Kamari to meet her privately, under the guise of discussing his intentions with Serafina. The meeting took place at an upscale restaurant, far from the estate and any prying eyes. Kamari arrived, nervous but curious. He had expected a stern conversation about his relationship with Serafina, perhaps a veiled warning to tread carefully. What he received was something entirely different. "Kamari," Maureen began, her tone smooth and deliberate, "you're an impressive young man. It's rare for someone from your background to carry themselves the way you do." "Thank you, Mrs. Larkwood," Kamari replied cautiously. "I'm just trying to make the most of the opportunities I've been given." Maureen leaned in slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "And what if I offered you an opportunity you couldn't refuse?" Kamari frowned, unsure of her meaning. "What kind of opportunity?" "A life most people only dream of," Maureen said, her voice steady. "I want you to marry me, Kamari." "Not Serafina." "Me." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Kamari stared at her, his mind racing. Maureen continued, unfazed by his silence. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted. Wealth, power, security. You'll never have to struggle again." "But Serafina and I," Kamari began, only to be cut off. "You and my daughter have nothing defined," Maureen said sharply. "She may want something from you, but I can give you everything. Think about it, Kamari. Don't waste time chasing what you may never have when you could have everything right now." Kamari left the meeting in a daze, his thoughts a chaotic mix of shock and temptation. The offer was outrageous, yet undeniably enticing. And as he grappled with the choice before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Maureen's proposal would change everything, for better or worse. What he didn't realize was that this choice would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could control. For Maureen, it was a chance to reclaim power. For Serafina, it was a betrayal she couldn't forgive. And for Kamari, it was the beginning of a journey that would end in unimaginable tragedy. For Kamari Blake, the proposal from Maureen Larkwood was both a dream and a nightmare. On one hand, the 27-year-old had never known wealth or security, and the life Maureen promised was unimaginable, a ticket out of the struggles that had defined his existence. On the other, his feelings for Serafina were real. She wasn't just another woman to him, she was someone who had seen the goodness in him when no one else had. But now, he was faced with a choice that no amount of charm or confidence could simplify. Accept Maureen's offer and betray Serafina, or reject it and risk losing everything, including Serafina herself. Kamari's first instinct was to confide in someone he trusted, someone who could offer perspective. That person was his best friend, Darian, a man who had always been his voice of reason. Darian had seen Kamari at his lowest and understood his struggles better than anyone. As they sat on a worn-out couch in Darian's modest apartment, Kamari laid out the details of Maureen's proposal. Darian listened intently, his face unreadable as Kamari described the offer, a marriage to a wealthy woman in exchange for a life of luxury. "Man, you serious?" Darian finally said, leaning back. "She really said all that? Marry her, and you get the keys to the kingdom?" Kamari nodded, his hands clasped tightly. "It's insane, right? I mean, she's Serafina's mom. And I care about Serafina." Darian's expression hardened. "Look, Kamari, let's be real for a second. You've been grinding your whole life. Struggling to pay bills, fighting for scraps. And now, you've got an opportunity most people would kill for. You think Serafina's gonna give you that kind of life?" Kamari hesitated, his thoughts a tangle of emotions. "It's not about the money with her. She's different." "Different don't pay the rent, bro," Darian shot back. "You're looking at the big leagues here. You marry Maureen, and yeah, maybe it's messy, but in a few years? She's older, Kamari. She's not gonna be around forever. You'll walk away with everything. Think about your future, man." Kamari wanted to argue, to push back against the cold logic of Darian's words, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the truth in them. This wasn't just about love, it was about survival. And survival had always been his priority. Despite Darian's advice, Kamari couldn't make a decision without being honest with Serafina. She deserved to know what her mother had proposed, even if it risked ruining everything between them. That night, he invited her over, his heart heavy with guilt and dread. As Serafina walked into his apartment, she immediately sensed his unease. "What's going on?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Kamari hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Your mom, she made me an offer. She wants me to marry her." For a moment, Serafina didn't react, as though the words didn't register. Then, her face twisted with disbelief and anger. "She what? Kamari, tell me you didn't even consider it." "I didn't give her an answer," Kamari said quickly. "I needed to talk to you first." Serafina's eyes blazed. "The fact that you didn't shut her down immediately says everything I need to know. How could you even think about it? Do you have any idea what this means?" "I didn't ask for this, Serafina." Kamari's voice rose, frustration spilling over. "Your mom came to me with this out of nowhere. She's relentless, and you know that. I'm just trying to figure out what to do." "What to do?" Serafina shot back. "You're supposed to love me. Or was that just a lie too?" "It's not a lie," Kamari said, his voice softening. "I care about you. But you have to understand, this isn't just about us. This is my life. My future." The tension between them hung heavy in the air. Serafina's heartbreak was palpable, but beneath her pain, something else stirred, rage. Not just at Kamari, but at her mother, whose actions had once again left her feeling powerless and betrayed. "This is how she works," Serafina said bitterly. She destroys everything good in my life just because she can. She doesn't care about you, Kamari. You're just another pawn in her game." Her words cut deep, but they also planted a seed in Kamari's mind. He knew Maureen's offer wasn't born out of love or affection, it was about power, control, and winning. And yet, that knowledge didn't make his decision any easier. As Serafina stormed out, her parting words echoed in Kamari's mind. "If you choose her over me, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Alone in the silence, Kamari wrestled with the weight of his decision. Darian's voice played in his head, urging him to think about his future. Serafina's voice, filled with hurt and anger, reminded him of the love he risked losing. And Maureen's offer loomed over everything, tempting him with the promise of a life he'd never dared to dream of. In that moment, Kamari realized that no matter what choice he made, someone would be betrayed. And betrayal, once set in motion, could never be undone. Serafina Larkwood had always been underestimated, by her mother, by society, and now, by Kamari Blake. But beneath her wounded exterior lay a mind sharp enough to orchestrate a plan that no one would see coming. When Kamari chose her mother over her, it stung. But the pain quickly turned into something else, a cold, calculated resolve to turn this betrayal into her triumph. Serafina wasn't about to let her mother win. Nor was she going to let Kamari walk away unscathed. Instead, she decided to play along, feigning acceptance of the situation while secretly setting the stage for revenge. When Serafina approached Kamari, she wore a mask of reluctant understanding. "If this is what you've chosen," she said, her voice soft and defeated, "then I won't stand in your way. But if you're going to marry her, we need to talk about what happens afterward." Kamari was hesitant, wary of her sudden change in tone. "What do you mean?" "She's controlling, Kamari," Serafina said, leaning closer, her voice laced with quiet intensity. "You think she'll just let you live your life? She won't. She'll own you. Unless we find a way to end this." Her words carried a double meaning, but Kamari only heard what he wanted to. To him, this was Serafina's way of saying she still cared, that she was willing to help him escape the iron grip of Maureen's control. He nodded slowly, unaware that he was being drawn into a web he wouldn't escape. "We'll do it together," Serafina said, her voice steady. "Once you're married, we'll make it look natural. She's older, it won't be hard to convince people her health failed." Kamari agreed, relieved to have Serafina by his side. What he didn't know was that Serafina's plan was never about freeing him. It was about framing him. Over the next few weeks, Serafina played her part flawlessly. She attended fittings, smiled through rehearsals, and even offered to help Kamari prepare for his new role as Maureen's husband. Behind the scenes, she was working tirelessly to set him up. The first step was installing a hidden camera in the kitchen, a room Kamari frequented during his visits to the estate. Positioned carefully, the camera captured a wide view of the countertops, ensuring it would record every move he made. Serafina knew Kamari would follow her instructions to administer the poison, but she planned to manipulate the footage to make it appear as though he acted alone. As the wedding day approached, Serafina provided Kamari with a vial of poison, carefully diluted to avoid immediate detection. "Just a small dose in her evening tea," she instructed. "It'll weaken her over time, and after the wedding, we'll give her a stronger dose to make it look like her heart gave out." Kamari hesitated but ultimately complied, driven by the belief that this was their shared escape plan. What he didn't know was that Serafina had secretly tampered with the dosage. Instead of gradually weakening Maureen, the increased concentration ensured her death would occur much sooner, on the day of the wedding itself. The night before the wedding, Kamari poured the first dose into Maureen's tea, just as Serafina had instructed. Maureen, unaware of the betrayal brewing around her, sipped the tea and smiled at Kamari. "You're going to make me so happy," she said, her voice warm for the first time since they met. Kamari forced a smile, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. What Kamari didn't realize was that the hidden camera in the kitchen had captured every moment, his hand shaking as he poured the poison, the tea being handed to Maureen. Serafina, watching the footage later that night, smirked. Everything was going according to plan. On the morning of the wedding, Serafina played the role of dutiful daughter, helping her mother prepare for the big day. Meanwhile, Kamari was riddled with guilt but pushed forward, believing that their shared plan would soon free him. Serafina, however, had already ensured that freedom wasn't in Kamari's future. Moments before the ceremony, Serafina discreetly added a final dose of poison to Maureen's pre-wedding drink, sealing her fate. She knew the effects would take hold during the reception, ensuring Maureen's death appeared sudden but plausible given her age. Maureen Larkwood's wedding dawned with a sense of surreal extravagance. Her sprawling estate, already a symbol of her wealth, had been transformed into a breathtaking venue. Crystal chandeliers sparkled in the soft sunlight, flowers imported from across the globe adorned every corner, and a string quartet played softly as guests arrived in designer attire. But while the day appeared magical to the unknowing observer, tension simmered beneath the surface. The bride, resplendent in a custom ivory gown, greeted her guests with a practiced smile that masked the undercurrents of unease. At her side stood Kamari Blake, her youthful groom, looking every bit the devoted husband-to-be, though his polished appearance couldn't hide the turmoil brewing within him. Meanwhile, Serafina moved quietly through the crowd, her calm demeanor concealing the storm of emotions and plans she had orchestrated leading to this very day. The whispers among the guests were unavoidable. Maureen's choice to marry a man nearly 50 years her junior was a scandalous subject. Some marveled at her audacity, while others questioned Kamari's motives. Yet no one dared voice their thoughts aloud in Maureen's presence, her commanding aura silencing even the boldest gossip. The ceremony began with all the splendor befitting Maureen's stature. As the bride walked down the aisle, the murmur of admiration from the attendees barely masked the incredulity in their eyes. Kamari waited at the altar, his expression carefully composed, though his hands trembled slightly as she approached. Serafina watched from the front row, her face unreadable. To the world, she was the supportive daughter witnessing her mother's happiness. Inside, she was counting the moments until her plan reached its climax. As the vows were exchanged, Maureen's voice was steady, her confidence unshaken. Kamari's responses, however, carried a faint hesitation, audible only to those who truly knew him. Serafina noted it with satisfaction, his nerves were her assurance that he remained unaware of her true intentions. When the ceremony concluded, applause erupted, and the newlyweds made their way to the reception. Guests mingled, sipping champagne and marveling at the sheer opulence of the event. But amid the celebration, an invisible thread of tension connected Maureen, Kamari, and Serafina, pulling tighter with each passing moment. The first dance was the centerpiece of the reception. The ballroom, illuminated by hundreds of candles, fell silent as Maureen and Kamari took the floor. The music began, a slow, melodic waltz, and all eyes turned to the couple. Maureen, ever graceful, moved with confidence, while Kamari's steps faltered slightly, his unease evident to anyone paying close attention. Serafina stood at the edge of the room, watching intently. She had ensured that everything was in place. The final dose of poison, slipped into Maureen's pre-reception drink, was already taking effect. Her timing had been precise, just enough to weaken her mother and bring about her collapse during the most public moment of the evening. And then, it happened. Maureen's movements slowed, her hand tightening around Kamari's shoulder. Her face, once glowing with confidence, twisted briefly in confusion before her legs gave way. Kamari tried to catch her, but the weight of her collapse sent them both to the floor. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and the music screeched to a halt. "Call 911, someone shouted, breaking the stunned silence. Guests rushed forward, forming a chaotic circle around the couple as paramedics were summoned. Kamari knelt beside Maureen, his hands shaking as he tried to rouse her. Serafina pushed through the crowd, her expression one of practiced shock, though her mind was racing with anticipation. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, lifting Maureen onto a stretcher and rushing her to the waiting ambulance. Kamari climbed in alongside her, his face pale and stricken. Serafina stayed behind, her calculated role as the grieving daughter ensuring she wouldn't raise suspicion. The ride to the hospital was brief, but for Kamari, it felt endless. He held Maureen's hand, whispering reassurances she couldn't hear. He hadn't expected this, not so soon. The plan, as Serafina had laid it out, was supposed to unfold over weeks, giving him time to adjust, to prepare. But now, as Maureen's breathing grew shallow, panic gripped him. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. Maureen Larkwood was pronounced dead on arrival. The news spread quickly, rippling through the estate like wildfire. Guests murmured in disbelief, their shock mingling with the faint satisfaction of scandal. Serafina, ever composed, comforted those around her, her tears perfectly timed and her sorrow convincingly genuine. Kamari returned to the estate hours later, his face a mask of confusion and grief. He sought out Serafina, desperate for answers. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice trembling. "You said we'd have time." Serafina placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression solemn. "It's not your fault, Kamari," she said softly. She was old. Her body couldn't handle the stress of the day. No one could have predicted this. Kamari nodded, though her words did little to ease his guilt. What he didn't know was that Serafina had orchestrated every moment of the day, ensuring that her mother's death would appear sudden yet plausible. And now, with Maureen gone, Serafina's true plan was only just beginning. The wedding day, intended to be a celebration of love, had ended in tragedy. But for Serafina, it marked the start of her victory. As the estate descended into mourning, she watched silently, knowing that the next phase of her scheme was already in motion. For Kamari, however, the nightmare was far from over. The storm Serafina had unleashed was only beginning to reveal its full force. Kamari was at home with Serafina when the news broke. An investigation into Maureen's sudden death had been ordered. He froze, panic tightening his chest. Serafina, ever composed, feigned shock and confusion, joining him in his disbelief. What Kamari didn't know was that Serafina herself had pushed for the investigation, her plan continuing to unfold with chilling precision. The autopsy revealed the truth Maureen's guests had no way of knowing: her death was no natural occurrence. Poisonous substances were found in her system, raising immediate suspicions. Detectives began piecing together the circumstances of her death, and two suspects quickly emerged: her new husband and her daughter. Both denied any involvement, but Serafina was ready for this moment. She approached the investigators with a carefully crafted story. "I noticed Kamari adding something to her drink," she said, her voice trembling as though she was reliving the memory. "When I asked him about it, he said it was just something to help her feel stronger. I didn't think much of it, not until now." Her words planted the first seeds of doubt against Kamari, but it was her next move that sealed his fate. Serafina revealed the existence of a hidden camera in the kitchen, claiming it was installed to monitor the household staff. The footage, however, showed Kamari pouring the substance into Maureen's tea the night before the wedding. The evidence appeared damning. When Kamari was confronted, his shock was genuine. "This can't be happening," he said, his voice shaking. "Serafina told me to do it. It was her plan all along." But Serafina had already positioned herself as the grieving daughter, a victim of both her mother's death and her husband's betrayal. In court, she testified against Kamari with heartbreaking conviction. "I trusted him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he loved her. I thought he loved me." Kamari's world crumbled. He realized, too late, that the woman he believed was his partner had orchestrated everything, not just Maureen's death, but his downfall as well. The evidence was overwhelming, and Serafina's betrayal cut deeper than any accusation. The investigation, seemingly solved, left Kamari facing consequences he hadn't prepared for. And for Serafina, her act of innocence solidified her victory, for now. But the truth, as Kamari would soon reveal, was far from over. Kamari Blake had been cornered, betrayed by the woman he thought was his ally. But when all seemed lost, he made a desperate move that would change everything. Late one night, as the weight of impending conviction pressed down on him, Kamari remembered something, a recording he had made weeks before, one he had kept as a precaution, never imagining it would be his lifeline. The next morning, Kamari contacted the detectives handling Maureen's case. His voice was steady, but the strain was evident. "I have evidence," he said. "Something you need to hear." The detectives, skeptical yet intrigued, agreed to meet him. Kamari handed over the device, a simple recorder containing a damning conversation between him and Serafina. The audio revealed her true intentions, how she had devised the plan to poison her mother, manipulated Kamari into carrying it out, and ensured the hidden camera would capture only him. Her voice was calm, calculated, and chilling as she detailed how he would take the fall. "This isn't just about her," Serafina had said in the recording. "It's about getting free from her control. You do your part, and I'll make sure no one looks your way." The detectives listened in silence, their expressions darkening as the truth unfolded. The evidence was undeniable. Serafina, the grieving daughter who had played the victim so convincingly, was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Armed with this new revelation, they moved swiftly. When the arrest came, it shocked everyone, including Kamari. Serafina was taken into custody, her facade of innocence shattered. Guests and family members who had once pitied her were left speechless, unable to reconcile the poised woman they knew with the criminal she had become. The trial that followed became a spectacle, drawing widespread attention. In the courtroom, Serafina fought to maintain her composure, adamantly proclaiming her innocence. She pointed fingers at Kamari, accusing him of fabricating the recording to save himself. Her defense painted her as the ultimate victim, trapped between a manipulative mother and a deceitful lover. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The recording, combined with the timeline of events and her suspicious behavior, painted a picture that even her skilled attorneys couldn't dismantle. Witnesses testified to her calculated nature, and prosecutors highlighted the methodical planning evident in every step of her scheme. Kamari, though initially seen as the primary suspect, became a reluctant figure of sympathy. His testimony, supported by the recording, revealed how deeply he had been manipulated. He recounted how Serafina had used her charm and his desperation to ensnare him in her deadly plot. The verdict was swift. Serafina was found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit murder. As the sentence was read, she maintained a stoic expression, though the mask cracked ever so slightly when her eyes met Kamari's across the courtroom. Serafina Larkwood, the once elegant daughter whose grief had masked her cunning, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Kamari Blake, though initially a suspect, was spared the harshest penalties. The court acknowledged his role in administering the poison, but his defense successfully argued that he acted under Serafina's manipulation and deception. His sentence was significantly lighter, 10 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy, with eligibility for parole after 5 years. For Kamari, the trial's end brought a bittersweet sense of closure. He had escaped the trap set for him, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. For Serafina, the courtroom marked the end of her carefully constructed narrative, a story of innocence that had unraveled under the weight of truth. And so, the tale of Maureen Larkwood's death came to an unexpected conclusion. What began as a scandalous union ended as a twisted saga of ambition, betrayal, and revenge. And as the dust settled, one question lingered: how far would someone go to protect themselves, even at the cost of the people they once claimed to love? This tragedy was a devastating reflection of greed, betrayal, and fractured relationships. Maureen's need for control, Serafina's thirst for revenge, and Kamari's moral compromises created a perfect storm that left destruction in its wake. Could this have been avoided? What if Maureen had shown compassion to her daughter? What if Serafina had sought forgiveness instead of vengeance? What if Kamari had chosen integrity over ambition? As we close this story, I ask, who is truly to blame? Was Kamari innocent, or did his choices make him equally guilty? And can betrayal ever lead to anything but ruin? If you found this story thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe for more gripping tales that challenge our understanding of human behavior. Thank you for watching.